The year was 1976, and the rural backroads of Alabama held secrets darker than the Spanish moss that hung from ancient oak trees. In a community where neighbors looked out for one another, and Sunday, church bells echoed across cotton fields, one property stood as an island of silence that would soon reveal horrors beyond human comprehension. What you're about to discover is not fiction. It's not a Hollywood creation designed to shock and entertain. This is a documented account of how one man's twisted mind created a prison so psychological, so complete, that his own daughter lived for years believing a lie that would shatter any normal person's understanding of reality. The case files from Jefferson County tell a story that challenges everything we think we know about manipulation, control, and the devastating power one person can hold over another. This is the story of Sarah Morrison, a young woman who escaped what can only be described as a living nightmare, and the man who should have protected her, but instead became her greatest threat. Prepare yourself for a journey into the darkest corners of human psychology, where the line between victim and reality becomes so blurred that the truth itself becomes a weapon of terror. Highway 78 cuts through Alabama like a scar across a landscape, connecting small towns that time seems to have forgotten. In 1976, if you drove 15 miles past the last gas station and turned onto a dirt road that disappeared into thick pine forest, you would eventually reach the Morrison property. Thomas Morrison had inherited the 200-acre farm from his father, a sprawling piece of land that included a 2-story farmhouse, several outbuildings, and enough isolation to make a person feel completely cut off from the rest of the world. The nearest neighbor lived 3 miles away, and the main road was just a memory by the time you reached the Morrison gate. Thomas was 42 years old, a man who commanded respect in the small farming community. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with calloused hands that spoke of hard work and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see everything. When he spoke, which wasn't often, people listened. He had a reputation as a stern but fair man, someone who kept himself but would help a neighbor in need. His wife, Margaret, had died 5 years earlier under circumstances that the community preferred not to discuss. The official cause of death was listed as accidental drowning in the farm's pond, but whispers followed the funeral like shadows. Margaret had been seen with bruises on her arms in the weeks before her death. She had seemed increasingly isolated, rarely coming to town, and when she did, she appeared nervous, constantly looking over her shoulder. After Margaret's death, Thomas raised their daughter Sarah alone. The community respected his dedication to single parenthood, though they noticed that Sarah rarely accompanied him to town anymore. When asked about her, Thomas would simply say she was helping around the farm, learning to be a proper woman. The farmhouse itself seemed to absorb sound rather than echo it. Painted white once upon a time, the structure had weathered to a dull gray that matched the Alabama clay. Windows stared out like vacant eyes, many of them covered with heavy curtains that blocked any view of the interior. The front porch sagged slightly under the weight of years, and the wooden steps creaked ominously with each footfall. Inside, the house was a maze of narrow hallways and small rooms that felt more like cells than living spaces. The kitchen was functional but sparse, equipped with the bare minimum needed for survival. The living room contained a single chair, a small television that received only 2 channels, and shelf-lined with religious texts and farming manuals. But it was the basement that held the property's darkest secrets, accessible only through a door in the kitchen that Thomas kept locked at all times. The basement had been converted into what he called Sarah's special room. The concrete walls were painted pink, a mockery of childhood innocence, and the single window had been bricked over years earlier. Sarah Morrison was 16 years old in 1976, though she looked younger due to malnutrition and the pale complexion of someone who rarely saw sunlight. Her blonde hair hung limp around her shoulders, and her green eyes held a haunted quality that would have alarmed anyone who truly looked at her. But Sarah rarely had visitors, and when she did encounter outsiders during the few times Thomas allowed her to accompany him to town, she remained silent, standing close to his side like a shadow. If spoken to directly, she would look to Thomas for permission before responding, and her answers were always brief, rehearsed-sounding phrases that revealed nothing about her inner world. The isolation of the Morrison property was both physical and psychological. Thomas had created a world where he was the sole source of information, comfort, and human contact for his daughter. Every book she read, every conversation she heard, every piece of information about the outside world came filtered through his carefully constructed reality. To the outside world, Thomas Morrison was a widowed farmer doing his best to raise a daughter alone. But behind the weathered walls of that isolated farmhouse, a different kind of family dynamic was taking place, one that would soon shock investigators and forever change how law enforcement understood the depths of psychological manipulation. The transformation of Sarah Morrison from daughter to prisoner did not happen overnight. It was a gradual process that began shortly after her mother's death, when Sarah was just 11 years old and vulnerable to her father's increasingly twisted interpretation of family relationships. Thomas began by isolating Sarah from any external influences. He removed her from school, telling the authorities that he would be providing home education on the farm. In 1971, rural Alabama's oversight of homeschooling was minimal at best, and a respected member of the community like Thomas faced little scrutiny over his decision. The curriculum Thomas designed for his daughter was unlike anything found in traditional education. Instead of mathematics and science, Sarah's lessons focused on what Thomas called womanly duties and biblical submission. He created a twisted version of religious education that emphasized a woman's complete obedience to her male guardian, carefully selecting and misinterpreting biblical passages to support his growing control over her mind. The physical isolation was reinforced by psychological manipulation that began with small lies and grew into a complete fabrication of reality. Thomas told Sarah that her mother had abandoned them because Sarah hadn't been a good enough daughter. He convinced her that the outside world was dangerous and full of people who would hurt her if they discovered how different their family was. Most insidiously, Thomas began to blur the lines of their relationship through what he called special lessons. He told Sarah that when a woman's mother died, it became her responsibility to take over all of her mother's duties. At first, this meant cooking and cleaning, but gradually it expanded to include what Thomas described as wifely obligations. Thomas created an elaborate mythology around their relationship, telling Sarah that in biblical times it was common and even preferred for fathers to marry their daughters to keep the family line pure. He showed her carefully selected historical examples and religious texts that seemed to support his claims, always presenting himself as the scholarly authority on these matters. The basement room became Sarah's world. Thomas told her it was their special place where they could be a real family without judgment from the ignorant outside world. He decorated it with items that a normal father might put in a daughter's bedroom, but the context he created turned innocent decorations into symbols of a perverted relationship. Sarah's daily routine was carefully controlled and monitored. She woke at dawn to prepare Thomas's breakfast, spent her mornings doing household chores, and her afternoons in what Thomas called education time. Evenings were reserved for family time, when Thomas would read to her from his selected texts and reinforce the lessons that were slowly reshaping her understanding of reality. The psychological conditioning was reinforced through a system of rewards and punishments that kept Sarah in a constant state of anxiety about pleasing her father. Approval meant extra food, a small gift, or permission to spend time outside the basement room. Disapproval meant isolation, reduced meals, and lectures about her failures as a daughter and wife. Thomas was careful to never use violence, understanding instinctively that physical abuse would leave marks that might be noticed by outsiders. Instead, he wielded emotional manipulation like a surgeon's scalpel, cutting away Sarah's sense of self and replacing it with his carefully constructed version of who she should be. By 1974, when Sarah was 14, the transformation was largely complete. She genuinely believed that she was Thomas's wife as well as his daughter, and that this arrangement was not only normal but blessed by God. She had been conditioned to see the outside world as a threat to their special relationship and to view herself as fortunate to have such a devoted husband and father. The few times Sarah encountered outsiders during necessary trips to town, she played the role Thomas had taught her perfectly. She was a quiet, obedient daughter who stayed close to her father and spoke only when spoken to. No one suspected that in her mind, she was also playing the role of devoted wife, protecting the secret of their special family from a world that wouldn't understand. What do you think about what you've witnessed so far? Can you imagine how a young mind could be shaped to accept such a twist of reality? What would you do if you suspected something like this was happening in your community? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The first crack in Thomas Morrison's carefully constructed world came from an unexpected source. A 17-year-old delivery boy named Jimmy Patterson, who had been dropping off farm supplies to the Morrison property for nearly 2 years. Jimmy had always been curious about the Morrison farm. Unlike other properties on his delivery route, the Morrison place felt different. The house was always too quiet, the curtains always drawn, and Thomas Morrison always met him at the gate rather than allowing him to drive up to the house like other customers did. In the spring of 1976, Jimmy arrived at the Morrison property on a particularly warm afternoon to find the front gate open for the first time. Thomas's truck was nowhere to be seen, and Jimmy made the decision that would change Sarah Morrison's life forever. Instead of leaving the supplies at the gate as usual, he decided to drive up to the house and leave them on the porch. As Jimmy approached the farmhouse, he heard something that made him stop his truck and listen more carefully. It was the sound of a woman crying, but not the normal crying of someone who was sad or hurt. This was the desperate, hopeless sobbing of someone who had reached the end of their endurance. The sound was coming from somewhere beneath the house, and Jimmy realized there must be a basement. He had delivered supplies to enough farms to know that most basements in this area were accessed from outside the house, and he began walking around the structure looking for an entrance. What Jimmy found was a set of concrete steps leading down to a heavy wooden door that looked completely out of place on a farm property. The door was secure with multiple locks, but one small window near the top had been left unbarred. Jimmy climbed the concrete steps and peered through the dirty glass. The sight that greeted him would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. In what appeared to be a basement room painted an incongruous pink, a young woman in a torn white dress was sitting on a small bed, rocking back and forth while crying. Her blonde hair was matted and unwashed, and her thin arms were wrapped around her knees in protective gesture that spoke of long-term trauma. But what shocked Jimmy most was not just the existence of this hidden prisoner, but something far more disturbing. On the walls of the basement room were dozens of photographs, and even from his limited viewpoint through the small window, Jimmy could see that they showed the same young woman in various poses with an older man he recognized as Thomas Morrison. The photographs were not the innocent family pictures one might expect. They were wedding-style portraits, romantic poses, and intimate images that no father should ever have with his daughter. Jimmy realized he was looking at evidence of something so twisted that his 17-year-old mind struggled to comprehend it. Jimmy's first instinct was to break down the door and rescue the young woman, but something about her behavior stopped him. When she noticed his face in the window, instead of running toward him for help, she screamed in terror and began calling for Thomas to protect her from the intruder. The young woman Jimmy was looking at was so thoroughly conditioned that she saw her potential, rescuer as a threat and her captor as her protector. This realization filled Jimmy with a horror deeper than anything he had experienced in his young life. Jimmy ran back to his truck and drove directly to the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department, where he told his story to Deputy Sheriff Robert Hayes. Hayes initially struggled to believe Jimmy's account, but the boy's obvious distress and the specific details he provided convinced the deputy that an investigation was warranted. Within 2 hours, Hayes returned to the Morrison property with a search warrant and 2 additional deputies. They found Thomas Morrison had returned and was working in his barn, apparently unaware that his secret had been discovered. When confronted by the deputies, Thomas remained calm and denied any wrongdoing. He claimed that Sarah was his daughter and that she lived in the basement room by choice because she preferred the cooler temperature. He insisted that any photographs the deputies might find were innocent family, pictures that had been misinterpreted by an imaginative teenager. But when the deputies forced open the basement door and entered Sarah's prison, they found evidence that no amount of explanation could justify. The room contained not just the disturbing photographs Jimmy had seen, but journals in Sarah's handwriting that detailed her daily life as both daughter and wife to Thomas Morrison. The journals revealed the depth of Thomas's psychological manipulation and Sarah's complete acceptance of their twisted relationship. She wrote about her duties as a wife, her fears of disappointing her husband, and her gratitude for being chosen for such a special role. Most disturbing of all, she wrote about her hopes of someday having children who would also understand the beauty of their pure family arrangement. We want to thank you immensely for staying with this investigation until this point. We truly appreciate your time and interest in uncovering this shocking case. We assure you that the most revealing and disturbing elements are still to come, and what you'll discover in the following chapters will completely transform your understanding of this horrific situation. The rescue of Sarah Morrison proved to be far more complicated than the deputies had anticipated. When they entered the basement room to bring her to safety, Sarah did not react like a typical victim of kidnapping or imprisonment. Instead, she fought against her rescuers with the desperation of someone who believed she was being torn away from her beloved husband. Please don't take me away from Thomas. Sarah screamed as Deputy Hayes attempted to guide her up the basement stairs. He's my husband. You don't understand. We love each other. The deputies exchanged horrified glances as they realized the full extent of the psychological damage that had been inflicted on this young woman. Sarah genuinely believed that she was married to her father, and that the deputies were the criminals, separating her from her rightful spouse. Thomas Morrison watched the scene unfold with an expression of calm satisfaction, as if he were proud of how well his psychological conditioning had worked. When Deputy Hayes placed him under arrest, Thomas's only comment was, "You'll never understand what we have. Sarah knows where she belongs." The journey from a Morrison property to the Jefferson County courthouse became a nightmarish ordeal for everyone involved. Sarah continued to plead for her father's release, insisting that the deputies had made a terrible mistake. She referred to Thomas as my husband and begged him to let her return to our home where she belonged. At the courthouse, Sarah was placed in protective custody while the authorities tried to figure out how to handle a victim who refused to acknowledge that she was a victim. Dr. Elizabeth Warner, a psychiatrist from Birmingham, was called in to evaluate Sarah's mental state and begin the process of helping her understand the reality of her situation. Dr. Warner's initial assessment was more disturbing than anyone had prepared for. Sarah exhibited all the signs of severe psychological conditioning, but with a twist that made her case unique in the psychiatric literature of the time. She had been so thoroughly manipulated that she had developed what Dr. Warner termed protective delusion, a mental state where the victim's mind had accepted an impossible reality in order to survive unbearable circumstances. Sarah doesn't just believe she's married to her father, Dr. Warner explained to the investigators. Her entire sense of identity, her understanding of love, family, and her place in the world has been constructed around this false reality. Attempting to shatter this delusion too quickly could cause a complete psychological breakdown. The investigation into Thomas Morrison's activities revealed a methodical campaign of psychological manipulation that had been years in the making. Searches of the property uncovered detailed journals, kept by Thomas himself, documenting his techniques for reshaping Sarah's understanding of their relationship. Thomas's journals revealed the calculating mind of a predator who understood exactly what he was doing. He had researched psychological conditioning techniques, studied cases of successful brainwashing, and applied these methods to his own daughter with scientific precision. His writings showed no remorse, only pride in the completeness of his control over Sarah's mind. The most chilling discovery came when investigators found Thomas's plans for the future. He had been preparing to move Sarah to an even more isolated location in rural Mississippi, where he planned to start what he called the second phase of their relationship, having children who would be raised from birth to accept their twisted family dynamic as normal. During the investigation, neighbors came forward with information that painted a picture of Thomas Morrison as a master manipulator who had been hiding his true nature for years. Several people recalled Margaret Morrison's increasing isolation before her death and her apparent fear of her husband in the months leading up to her drowning. A second examination of Margaret Morrison's death revealed inconsistencies that had been overlooked during the original investigation. Medical records showed injuries consistent with prolonged physical abuse, and witness statements suggested that Margaret had been trying to leave Thomas in the weeks before her death. The realization that Thomas Morrison had likely murdered his wife to prevent her from exposing his abuse of their daughter added another layer of horror to an already incomprehensible case. Sarah had not only been victimized by her father, but she had also been isolated and controlled by the man who had probably killed her mother. As Thomas Morrison sat in his jail cell awaiting trial, he showed no signs of remorse or recognition that his actions were wrong. When questioned by investigators, he spoke about his relationship with Sarah as if it were the most natural thing in the world, expressing frustration that others couldn't understand the purity of their love. The confrontation between reality and delusion was about to reach its climax, as Sarah Morrison would be forced to confront the truth about her life, her father, and the mother she barely remembered. The process of helping Sarah Morrison understand reality of her situation became one of the most challenging cases in Dr. Elizabeth Warner's 20-year career. Sarah's resistance to accepting the truth about her relationship with her father was so intense that she required around-the-clock supervision to prevent her from harming herself. For the first 2 weeks of her protective custody, Sarah refused to eat, insisted on wearing the white dress Thomas had given her as a wedding gift, and spent hours each day crying for her husband to come and take her home. She could not understand why everyone was trying to convince her that something beautiful and pure was actually sick and wrong. Dr. Warner's approach required extraordinary patience and careful psychological maneuvering. Rather than directly attacking Sarah's beliefs about her relationship with Thomas, the doctor began by helping Sarah remember her life before her mother's death, when she had been a normal little girl with normal family relationships. The breakthrough came during Sarah's 3rd week in custody, when Dr. Warner showed her photographs of herself as a young child with her mother. For the first time since her rescue, Sarah's carefully constructed emotional barriers began to crack as she remembered the woman she had barely thought about in years. "I had a mother," Sarah whispered, staring at a photograph of herself at age 6, sitting on Margaret Morrison's lap and smiling with genuine childhood happiness. "I remember her reading to me. She used to brush my hair and sing songs. As Sarah's memories of her mother began to return, the contradictions in Thomas's version of reality became impossible to ignore. If she had always been destined to be Thomas's wife, why did she have such clear memories of having a different relationship with him when she was small? Why did she remember calling him Daddy instead of Thomas? Dr. Warner carefully guided Sarah through the process of examining her memories, helping her distinguish between what she actually remembered and what Thomas had told her to remember. It was during one of these sessions that Sarah experienced what Dr. Warner described as a reality cascade, a sudden, overwhelming understanding of how completely she had been manipulated. The moment of awakening was devastating for Sarah. As the truth crashed over her in waves, she experienced every emotion she had been denied for years: rage at her father, grief for her lost childhood, shame over things that were never her fault, and a profound sense of betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound could have. "He stole my life," Sarah sobbed during one particularly difficult session. "He killed my mother, and then he stole my life and made me into something I was never supposed to be." The investigation had indeed confirmed Sarah's sudden realization about her mother's fate. A new autopsy of Margaret Morrison's remains revealed evidence that her drowning had not been accidental. She had been held underwater long enough to leave distinctive marks on her throat, and her blood showed evidence of sedatives that would have made it impossible for her to swim. Thomas Morrison had murdered his wife when she discovered what he was doing to their daughter and threatened to expose him. He had then used Margaret's death as another tool of control, convincing Sarah that her mother had abandoned them because Sarah wasn't good enough to love. As Sarah's understanding of reality solidified, she began to remember details that helped prosecutors build their case against Thomas. She recalled her father's threats about what would happen if she ever told anyone about their special relationship. She remembered being forced to practice talking about Thomas as if he were just her father when they occasionally encountered other people. Most importantly, Sarah remembered her mother's last words to her: "If anything ever happens to me, remember that you are my daughter, not anyone's wife. You are just a little girl who deserves to be loved and protected, not used." The trial of Thomas Morrison became a landmark case in the study of psychological manipulation and family abuse. Sarah's testimony, delivered with remarkable strength despite her ordeal, provided unprecedented insight into how a predator could completely reshape a victim's understanding of reality. Thomas Morrison was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of his wife and multiple counts of child abuse and sexual assault related to his treatment of Sarah. He was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, where he remained until his death in 1994. Sarah Morrison, with the help of extensive therapy and the support of foster families who understood her unique trauma, gradually rebuilt her understanding of normal family relationships and her place in the world. She changed her name, completed her education, and eventually became an advocate for other victims of psychological manipulation. The Morrison case led to significant changes in how law enforcement and mental health professionals approach cases of psychological abuse. It demonstrated that victims of extreme manipulation might not recognize themselves as victims and might actively resist rescue attempts. The case of Sarah Morrison and Thomas Morrison stands as one of the most disturbing examples of psychological manipulation ever documented in American criminal history. It shows us how a trusted family member can become the greatest threat to a child's psychological development, and how the human mind can be shaped to accept even the most impossible realities when survival depends on it. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how we protect the most vulnerable members of our society. How many other children might be suffering in isolation, convinced that their abuse is normal or even blessed? How many signs of psychological manipulation do we miss because the victims have been conditioned not to ask for help Sarah Morrison's story is ultimately one of survival and recovery, but it took decades of therapy and support for her to fully reclaim her identity and understand that none of what happened to her was her fault. Her courage in testifying against her father helped ensure that he could never harm another child, and her later work as an advocate has helped countless other survivors. What do you think about how society fails to protect its most vulnerable members? Do you believe that signs of psychological manipulation like this could be detected earlier if communities were better educated about the warning signs? How can we create systems that protect children even when their abusers are the very people who should be protecting them? Your thoughts and perspectives are crucial to keeping this important conversation alive and helping others recognize the dangers that can exist behind closed doors. Please share your opinions in the comments section. Your voice matters in the fight against child abuse and psychological manipulation. If this investigation has impacted you and opened your eyes to the reality of psychological abuse, please subscribe to our channel and activate notifications for more in-depth investigations of real cases that have shaped our understanding of human psychology and criminal behavior. Don't miss our next video, the woman who kept her 7 children in prison for 20 years. An even more disturbing story that will challenge everything you think you know about maternal instinct and the lengths some people will go to maintain control over their families.